Just going to quickly take you through a secondary analysis of the data of the advanced and Namsal studies looking at hypertension. These are my disclosures. So we have a lot of hypertension in the sub-Saharan region, and it's a leading cause of death. And various reports, including from our group, which demonstrated a fairly big jump in blood pressure when we moved from efavirenz-based regimens to dolutegravir in line with WHO recommendations, meant that we were interested in looking at these changes in blood pressure, particularly as we'd shown these changes in weight gain with TAF and with second-generation integrase inhibitors over and above tenofovir, disoproxil, and efavirenz. And also because we know that weight gain is associated with a rise in blood pressure and other NCDs. So just to familiarize yourself again, I'm just going to take you through the key points, and thanks to the Namsal team for letting me present their data. Namsal was conducted in Cameroon, a very poor African country, and they compared low-dose efavirenz, 400 milligrams of efavirenz, against dolutegravir in a randomized controlled study started around 2015, and the first data presented in 2019. It's very important to understand that in Cameroon, like in much of Africa, antihypertensive therapy is not offered routinely in primary health care for free. Patients actually have to go and buy their medication. About 1% of patients on Namsal who had hypertension at entry, diagnosed hypertension, and a very few were treated through the course of the study for their hypertension. Just in terms of the numbers that I think are important, I just pointed out there, you can see their BMI on average was about 23 between both arms, and C4s in the late 200s. As you'd expect, as the patient's BMI went up, they had a greater prevalence of hypertension, with over a third of the patients with a BMI over 30 having hypertension, grade 1 hypertension with this definition. As you probably all familiar with this data now, Namsal demonstrated this rise in blood pressure, which was more significant in the dolutegravir group and which was more significant amongst women over the entire 192-week period. This is probably the important data coming from out of the Namsal study looking at blood pressure, and you can see that blood pressure did rise in both arms, but was significantly greater in the dolutegravir arm, with about 6.5 millimeters of mercury difference between the two arms. And I'm sure most of you are not hypertensivologists, but a 5 millimeter change up or down excites them. So this is significant, particularly over less than, well, about 3.5-year period. Then breaking it into these various categories and looking at the dolutegravir versus efavirenz group, you can see that it became significant out at the 144, 192-week period. And as I said, very few of these patients had their blood pressure treated over this course of events. This puts it into the various boxes of grade 1, grade 2, and grade 3. And you can see significant differences from the get-go. Advance had a third arm where we had a TAF arm. We dosed efavirenz at 600 milligrams, so conventionally. And it's much easier in South Africa where hypertension therapy is freely available through primary care. So patients were routinely looked after, and there was a strong SOP in the clinic, which meant that these patients were picked up and treated. The patients were slightly heavier on entry, and the CD4 counts were 60, 70 cells higher than in the Namsal cohort. Again, this weight gain, that signal that you're all familiar with now, which was greater in the TAF arm than in both dolutegravir arms compared to the efavirenz arm, which we're fairly clear now is probably due to efavirenz mitigation and toxicity and tenofovir mitigation. What's interesting in the advanced arm is about 10% of the patients entered the study with hypertension, treated hypertension, and another 10-11% were treated subsequently. And because of the SOPs in the clinic, all the patients, almost every patient received hypertension therapy. And here you can see the differences. There's a bit of a gap there at 144 weeks. We couldn't get consent during that period because of COVID. So there's a bit of a gap in terms of data entry there. But you can see out to 192 weeks, just over 2 millimeters mercury difference between the TAF arm and the other arms. Well, the efavirenz arm certainly, which you could question whether that's clinically significant. We amalgamated the dolutegravir arms together to see if we could tease out a difference. You can say we can only just start seeing a difference out at the 192-week period of the efavirenz arm. Again, using the various buckets, you can see that patients were treated. So there's almost no difference between the various arms in terms of statistical testing. Because we have obviously more granular data, and because we tested TAF and tenofovir, we have a lot of renal markers. We're busy doing a deep dive into the whole of clever analysts who are going to be looking at this, but it's fairly clear I'm certainly looking at the advanced data that the blood pressure tracks weight very, very closely. It doesn't seem to track renal problems or issues or any of the markers at all. It really seems to be closely correlated with weight. So limitations, and I think these are important thinking about blood pressure and just to be conscious of, is that blood pressure measurement is not standardized. It's not just not standardized across HIV studies. It's pretty much not standardized outside of blood pressure studies. One of the confounders is that certainly Advance and Namsal didn't have standardized cuff sizes for people with above a BMI of 35 where it's recommended. Again, it's fairly standard. And how they measured blood pressure was not standardized. You're supposed to be sitting and at rest for a couple of minutes, and there's a whole standardized algorithm for that. The higher risk of blood pressure is at least partly, if not totally, due to the rising body weight on treatment and aging. And I think it's going to be very important to look at these other cohorts I'm coming to in a moment. And the question is this simply a return to health effect? And a lot of the key RCTs that have come out and other studies have not been reported. And Andy Hill, who's in the audience here, has put together all this list of studies on where we've got to. And you can see it's a messy amalgamation of some studies showing an association with these drugs and some showing no association and no blood pressure change. And I think there's a story here that needs to be unpacked as we go along. And some of the studies are registration studies which apparently didn't measure blood pressure, where we don't have data to actually look at. In the observational study, including ours, there's a fairly consistent rise in blood pressure when looking at dolutegravir versus the other regimens. And as I said, there's some data coming out at this conference which will hopefully unpack this. So in Namsal, where hypertension wasn't consistently treated, the blood pressure was high in the dolutegravir containing regimen, but that was the regimen that was associated with the most weight gain. When advanced, we saw almost no differences in blood pressure change, but we were treating everybody. I think it's very important here to not associate causation with the specific drugs. We made this mistake with weight gain, where the immediate response, particularly to advanced Namsal, was that dolutegravir was causing the weight gain or TAF, and I think we now know that that's probably not the case. And finally, it's really important that I think the message for healthcare providers and for people with HIV is that hypertension is something you need to be watching out for, but it can be very successfully treated if you diagnose it. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.